galaxy had a word for what Earth was. In the old Keth dialects, it translated loosely as the wound that will not close. In the formal, bureaucratic tongue of the Galactic Directorate, it was catalogued under Anomalous Biosphere Classification 9, a designation reserved for worlds so hostile to organized life that colonization was deemed economically irrecoverable. In the private language of Vael military intelligence, the analysts simply called it the Scar World and left a blank where the threat assessment should have been, because no threat assessment they filed ever survived peer review without someone crossing it out and writing the same 2 words in red, too extreme. None of that mattered to Sergeant Davenrell. What mattered to Davenrell, on the morning that the Directorate's reclamation fleet dropped out of fold space above the ruins of Earth's second moon, was the state of his air recycler. It was producing a faint smell of burnt copper. He had been nursing it for 11 months with spare parts scavenged from 3 dead Directorate drones and a length of coolant tubing he had stripped from the wreck of a Vail interceptor in what used to be the Norwegian fjords, and now it was starting to smell like burnt copper, which meant the filtration membrane was degrading, which meant he had maybe 6 weeks of clean air left, which meant he needed to find another solution before 6 weeks were up, because there was no backup. That was the shape of his world. One problem, solved. Next problem, immediate. No room between them for despair. He ran the morning check the way he ran it every morning, the same sequence, the same order, no variation, because variation bred complacency, and complacency got you killed on a planet with 37 active Keth scanner arrays and a standing Directorate erasure order with his biometric signature attached to it. Perimeter sensors, 11 active, 2 showing degraded signal, 1 offline. He made a note to replace the offline unit before dusk. Crop beds, soil moisture adequate in 6 of 8, borderline in 2. He adjusted the irrigation manually, rerouting water from the upper collection tank through a series of channels he had dug with, his hands in the autumn of his 2nd year, when the automated systems had failed and the choice was dig or watch the food die. Food stores, adequate for 4 months if he continued current rationing. He was always hungry. He had been always hungry for so long that it had stopped feeling like deprivation and started feeling like weather, like cold, like something the body simply incorporated into its baseline state and stopped reporting as an emergency. The cabin he had built over 3 years in the deep Scottish Highlands was invisible from the air. He knew this because the Directorate had flown grid-pattern atmospheric sweeps 14 times since he had constructed it and found nothing. It was not magic, it was physics. The roof was covered in living sod and woven conifer branches replanted into a shallow substrate, maintained and trimmed with the same attention he gave his crops. The walls were double-layered stone and packed earth. The heat signature was managed through a geothermal exchange system he had assembled from memory, from a paper he had read once in a university library in Aberdeen when he was 23 years old, and the world had not yet ended. He had a remarkable memory. It had kept him alive more than any weapon. He checked the Ridgeline scanner last, the way he always did, saving it for last because it was the one that could actually ruin his day. It showed nothing. The valley below was empty. The Directorate patrol that had passed through 12 days ago had not returned. He let out a breath he had not known he was holding, exhaled it into the cold morning air, watched it curl away like smoke from a fire too small to warm anything. Then he went to tend his garden. It was not a garden in any aesthetic sense. It was a survival apparatus. 12 varieties of root vegetables selected for caloric density and cold tolerance, cultivated in raised beds lined with scavenged composite panels. 2 varieties of leafy greens engineered from seed stock he had protected through 2 winters in vacuum-sealed containers, wrapped in thermal batting and buried beneath the cabin's foundation during the worst of the processor winters when the temperature had dropped low, enough to kill anything not protected. A small fungal culture running in the dark corner of the supply room that produced enough protein supplement to stave off the worst of the nutritional deficiencies. He moved through the rows with the efficiency of long practice, pulling runners, checking for pest damage, testing soil acidity with a strip kit he had been diluting for 8 months because there were no more strip kits anywhere he could reach. His hands were thick with old calluses. His knuckles had been broken so many times they no longer returned fully to their original shape. He did not think about the knuckles. They still worked. He was 31 years old. He looked 50. The war had started when he was 26. The Directorate had not called it a war. They had called it a reclamation, which was a word that implied the thing being reclaimed had once belonged to them. And maybe in the deep archival sense they were right. Because Earth had been seeded with proto-life by the same ancient architects who had seeded 100 other worlds in this arm of the galaxy, and the Directorate's legal claim to all architect-seeded worlds was 300,000 years old and backed by 11 fleet carrier groups and a bureaucratic apparatus so vast it had its own solar system. The documentation was thorough. The legal framework was meticulous. The Directorate had been doing this for 3 centuries, and they were very good at it. What they were not good at, it turned out, was Earth. 7 billion people had lived on Earth when the first Keth atmospheric processors began their work. The processors were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were enormous, elegant machines that altered atmospheric composition over periods of months, tuning the air to Directorate's standard breathability, which was thinner and colder and had a different nitrogen-oxygen ratio than Earth's native mix. Breathable by Directorate standard physiology. Survivable, barely, for humans if they adapted quickly. The Directorate had done this to 43 other worlds. On 43 other worlds, the indigenous populations had been cataloged, assessed, and relocated to designated sanctuary zones before the atmospheric correction began. The process was documented. The documentation was accurate. It was also, on each of those 43 worlds, the product of a situation in which the indigenous population had, when presented with the full military reality of the Directorate's reclamation fleet, made the rational economic decision to cooperate with relocation in exchange for continued existence. Earth had been presented with the same military reality. Earth had made a different decision. The Directorate's initial tactical models had described coordinated worldwide resistance as statistically impossible. The Directorate's second-generation models, produced 6 months into the reclamation, had described it as statistically possible but strategically unsustainable. The Directorate's third-generation models, produced at the 2-year mark, had stopped describing it in terms of probability and had begun describing it in terms of cost, which was a significant and unacknowledged shift. By year 3, the models were not being published. By year 4, the senior analyst responsible for the Earth Reclamation Assessment had requested a transfer to another posting. The request had been denied. What happened over the following years was not something Davon thought about in narrative terms. It was more like weather. It had rained fire for a while, in the early days when the Directorate fleet was still trying decisive action and still believed decisive action would be decisive. The fire had eventually stopped, not because the Directorate ran out of the capacity for it, but because the Directorate's calculus changed, and fire that was not producing strategic results was fire being wasted, and waste was something the Directorate's administrators noticed. What was left after the fire was what always survived weather, the things that had gone to ground, the things that had made themselves invisible and set about the hard, quiet, uncelebrated work of continuing. He was almost finished with the morning work when the sensor on the eastern ridge triggered. Not a Directorate sweep pattern, not the slow geometric grid of their atmospheric drones. A single moving contact, ground level, bipedal, moving fast and then stopping, moving and stopping, using cover. Someone who knew how to move. He watched the sensor readout for 4 minutes without moving, crouched in the shadow of the supply room door with his rifle across his thighs, reading the pattern. 2 individuals, he decided. One moving while one was stationary. The stationary one was staying very still, which was its own skill. You could train someone to move quietly, but the ability to stay absolutely still under pressure was something different, something that either came naturally or was burned into a person by experience. Both of these people had it. He felt the old cold settle into his chest. Not fear exactly. Fear had been metabolized into something more functional a long time ago. It was more like the body's recognition that the math had changed and needed to be recalculated. He moved to the second position, the one in the rocks above the north face, and waited. They came over the ridge 40 minutes later. He had them in the scope before they knew the scope existed. 2 figures moving cautiously through the dead bracken, both wearing scavenged gear, Directorate surplus by the look of the thermal underlayer, both carrying small packs. The first was taller, older, moved with the deliberate care of someone managing pain, favoring the left leg with the subtle repetitive compensation of a chronic injury rather than a fresh one. The second was smaller, lighter, moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become, entirely natural, who had stopped thinking about how to move and had become the movement. Both were human. He kept the scope on them for a long time. Being human did not mean safe. He had learned that lesson in the first winter, from a man who had seemed genuinely friendly for about 3 days. He did not make the same mistake twice. He watched them approach the outer perimeter and watched them find one of his marker stones. The younger one crouched and examined it for perhaps 20 seconds, then straightened and changed direction by about 15 degrees, which was exactly the correct response to the marker, the response that would take them around the outer sensor ring rather than through it. She had read it correctly. He had left that marker partly as a test, had placed it where it would be visible to anyone approaching with the right kind of attention, and had encoded it with just enough survival sign to be readable to someone who understood the language. She understood the language. He came down from the rocks and let them see him. The older woman stopped first, the way experienced people stopped, smooth deceleration, no sudden movement, hands visible and away from the body in the same practiced motion. The younger one was a half step behind and did the same. Good training, or better, good instinct. He kept the rifle leveled, not threatening, just present. There was a language to these moments that anyone who had survived long enough knew. "You found my markers," he said. His voice was strange to him. He used it so rarely that it had developed a slight roughness, as though the mechanism needed to be warmed up. "Wasn't hard," the older woman said. She had an accent he could not quite place, something that had been worn smooth by years of not staying anywhere long enough to be defined by the local phonology. Her eyes were very steady, taking him apart and cataloging him the way an engineer cataloged a new system. "You've been here long enough to get comfortable. Comfortable people leave signs. What do you want?" The younger one spoke before the older could answer. "Food, shelter. We've been walking for 6 days." Her voice was flat with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, tracking everything: the rifle, the cabin entrance, the ridge behind him. She was doing what he did, reading angles, calculating. He stood there for a moment. The math was simple and cruel, and he had done versions of it before, twice before, and both times had calculated no, and both times had been right, and both times had cost him something. Adding 2 people to a 4-month food supply halved that supply. Adding 2 people who could work reduced the consumption rate. Adding 2 people who could not be trusted was a death sentence either way, their attack or the Directorate's finding. Adding 2 people who could be trusted was the first time he would have spoken to another human being for 11 months. He was very tired of the silence. "Come inside," he said, "but understand something first. I have 12 trip sensors between here and the cabin, and I know where every one of them is, and you don't. Stay in my footsteps exactly. If you diverge by more than a body width, I'll assume you're trying something." The older woman's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "Fair enough," she said. Her name was Sarah. The younger one was called Myrek. They were not mother and daughter, he learned over the following days. Though they had the comfortable economy of people who had survived together for a long time, that particular shorthand of shared emergency that builds faster and stronger than years of ordinary companionship. Sarah had been a structural engineer before the reclamation. She had been designing bridge infrastructure in what had been Rotterdam when the first processor units deployed. Merrick had been a biology student in her 2nd year at a university whose name, she said once, she no longer said out loud. He did not ask why. He understood that there were names, and there were places, and there were things that cost too much to invoke. He showed them the basics of the space: water collection, rationing protocol, what was edible and where it was stored. He showed them this partly as courtesy, and partly because he was watching their eyes as he explained it, reading what they cataloged and what they dismissed, what they asked follow-up questions about and what they let pass. Myrek cataloged everything in one slow, systematic pass around the room, and then sat down and said nothing, which he respected immediately. Sarah asked 2 questions, both structural, both intelligent, both about load-bearing and water routing, the questions of someone who understood the engineering of a survival system and was checking his solutions against her own instincts. Her instincts were good. His solutions were better in 2 places, and she recognized this immediately, and said so without difficulty, which told him something important. "What's your name?" Mirek asked that evening while they were eating. "Rel," he said. "Just Rel? What's the point of a first name," he said, "when there's nobody left who uses it?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, something between recognition and something else. Then she looked away. In his front pocket, folded and worn to the texture of cloth, was a photograph of a woman with dark hair laughing at something outside the frame. He did not look at it often, but he knew exactly how many folds it had and which one was about to tear, and he had been meaning to reinforce it with adhesive tape for 6 months. He had not done it. He was not yet sure why. They settled into a routine over the following days. Comfort required trust, and trust required time, and they were all moving through time very carefully, as if time were a resource as finite as everything else. But the routine had its own logic independent of trust, because the routine was survival, and survival did not wait for anyone to feel comfortable. Sarah was an extraordinary problem solver, the kind who looked at a broken system and immediately decomposed it into its components without being told to, who did not need to be assigned the problem before she began working on it. She had the air recycler's filtration membrane analyzed and partially reconstructed within 4 days, using a polymer sheet she had been carrying in her pack, for reasons she said she had forgotten but which Rel suspected she had been saving for the right application, recognizing potential without yet knowing the problem it would solve. He watched her work and felt something shift, some weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was separate from himself. Myrek worked the garden with a precision that came from actual botanical training, not from the survival improvisation he had been practicing. Within a week, the yield variance on the 2 borderline beds had improved measurably, the result of adjustments so subtle he had not been able to identify them watching her work. She did not explain what she had done. If he asked, she would tell him, he thought, but she did not offer it, and he found he did not need to ask. The results were the explanation. She was quieter than Sarah and more watchful. When she spoke, it was usually a single precise sentence that contained more information than it appeared to contain, compressed and dense. He found he had to pay attention when she spoke, the way you paid attention to sensors with quiet signals, because the signal-to-noise ratio was extremely high. On the 8th night, the directorate's signals changed. He woke at 0230 to the alarm on his scanner array, not the slow pulse of a survey sweep, but the tight, rapid pattern of an active search grid. He was dressed and at the console before Sarah and Myrek appeared in the doorway, both alert, reading his posture before he spoke. "Active search," he said. "Keth tactical sensors. This is not a routine sweep. Someone flagged this valley specifically." "Use," Sarah said flatly, not a question. "Where did you come through before the eastern ridge?" "Grampian Pass," Myrek said. "We had a contact 2 days out, a Keth patrol unit. We evaded it." She paused. "We believed we evaded it." "You were tagged," Rel said, "not captured." "Tagged. They use passive biotracers in their perimeter protocols now. Aerosolized, settles on clothing and skin. Doesn't interfere with the target, but it gives them a track that reads clean on their own sensors. They let the prey run and follow the signal. Cheaper than pursuit." Sarah's expression did not change, but something went very tight around her eyes. The engineer processing an error in her model. "How long do we have?" He looked at the scan pattern. "They're moving in an arc. Systematic. They are not certain yet. They are narrowing from a probability radius. Maybe 4 hours before this specific grid square becomes their highest probability location." He looked at the cabin, at the garden, at the supply room, at the 3 years of accumulated careful work. "We need to move." "We," Myrek said, very quietly. A single word, but he heard everything in it. She was asking whether he was going to cut them loose now that they had cost him something. It was a fair question. It was the kind of question people asked when they had been given good historical reason to expect the answer to be yes. When the world had taught them, repeatedly and specifically, that attachment was a liability and abandonment was the economically coherent choice. He looked at her. "We," he said. "They packed in 20 minutes. He had a go bag already assembled and had been refining it for over a year. Every item chosen with the specific calculus of weight versus necessity versus multi-use potential." He stood for a moment in the supply room and looked at the shelves, at the equipment that had kept him alive through 2 winters, and he made choices. He took the seed cache, 47 varieties in vacuum-sealed containers that weighed less than 2 kilograms total. He took the signal kit. He reached for the photograph and stopped with his hand near his pocket, and then put the photograph away without looking at it. But he put it in the breast pocket, the one closest to his heart, because that was where it had lived since the first winter. They went north. The Keth were good trackers. He knew this in the abstract and then learned it more immediately over the following 16 hours as the search grid compressed behind them, and twice he had to change direction, because his sensors showed flanking elements moving to cut off the routes his model predicted he would take. The Keth were not like Directorate regulars, who were soldiers in the bureaucratic sense, competent within doctrine and slow outside it. The Keth were something older and more autonomous. They moved like hunters, which was precisely what they were. They had been the Directorate's hunter caste for 300 years, bred for it and shaped by it, and they were, in their specific domain, extraordinary. What they were not good at was predicting what a human would do next. Rel had noticed this early in the conflict. In the first year, when the resistance still had enough people and enough coordination to conduct something resembling organized operations. The Keth operated on a predictive model that accounted for resource optimization, for the rational decisions that prey species made under pressure. Every species the Directorate had ever reclaimed had, when pushed to an extreme, behaved rationally, had made the economically coherent choice, had preserved resources, minimized risk, chosen survival over expenditure. Their models were built on 3 centuries of consistent data. Humans, when cornered, did not consistently do this. He used this 3 times in 16 hours. The first time he crossed open ground he did not need to cross. A burned field with no cover, 200 meters of exposure, crossing it because the Keth would predict he would skirt it. And the skirting route was where the flankers would be. The second time he circled back toward the search grid, actually moved toward the hunters, passed within 400 meters of a Keth flanker in a stand of dead spruce, because no prey species in the Directorate's 3 centuries of cataloged experience had ever voluntarily reduced the distance to the pursuit element. The third time he led them down into a river and waded upstream for 2 kilometers in water so cold it had passed beyond sensation, gone from cold to electric to nothing, because the Keth thermal sensors classified the water as a dead zone and stopped tracking anything inside it. On the far bank, Mrick sat on a rock and wrung water from her sleeves with the precise mechanical movements of someone managing a body that had passed through protest and arrived at simple function. Sarah was attending to her left leg. Rel looked and saw the brace assembly he had not noticed before, built from Directorate salvaged alloy and biofoam, a custom construction. He understood now that the favoring had not been random. She had been managing ongoing pain this entire time and had mentioned it 0 times. That leg, he said. Manageable, she said without looking up. I have analgesic tabs, Directorate medical kit. I've been rationing them. She looked up then. Something passed quickly through her face. I know you do. I cataloged your supplies when you showed us the cabin. I didn't ask because asking costs something. He understood. You did not ask for things from people you did not trust because asking created obligation. An obligation with strangers was a liability that could resolve in several directions and not all of them survivable. He dug the tabs from his pack and handed her the appropriate dose without comment. And she took them without comment. And something was communicated between them in that silence that neither could have articulated, but both understood completely, which was how the most important agreements were usually made. They found the relay station on the 3rd day. Rel had known about it for 4 months, but had not gone near it because going near it alone was not survivable. It was a Keth communications node, a squat prefabricated structure half buried in a hillside 11 kilometers northeast of where the cabin had been, left from the first wave of the reclamation. The Keth had abandoned it as operationally obsolete 6 months ago, when the Directorate upgraded communications architecture to a higher encryption tier, but the power plant was still running on its fuel cycle, and the node's passive receivers were still active, which meant it was still pulling in Directorate traffic, encrypted Directorate traffic that, if you had the right approach and the right decryption seed, and knew precisely where to look, contained fleet positioning data. He explained this to Sarah and Mirek over a fire that night, a fire kept small and smokeless the way he kept all his fires. Mirek listened without expression. Sarah's eyes went distant in the way they did when she was running calculations she was not yet ready to externalize. What would you do with fleet positioning data? Mirek said. There are ground-based transmission arrays still operational, Rel said. Military-hardened, deep bunker EMP shielded. I know of 3 that survived the initial bombardment. 2 are inaccessible. 1 is not. You're talking about broadcasting to a third party, Sarah said. Her voice was careful, precise. The engineer checking tolerances before committing to a design. There are signals in the deep comm bands, he said. He had been sitting on this for months. turning it over in the quiet of the cabin at Urzo 300, when the sleep would not come, and the photograph would not let him rest. Not human signals, not directorate. Someone on frequencies the directorate does not actively monitor because those frequencies associated with older technology, older standards. Someone has been listening on those frequencies for a long time. Consistently, patiently. Mirek sat up straighter, very slightly. A third party, Sarah said. You think there's a third party that wants what we could offer? The directorate is that large and that old, Rel said. An organization that size always has enemies. And an organization that size, when it commits significant fleet resources to a reclamation on the outer arm, is leaving gaps somewhere, creating pressure points somewhere else. He looked at the fire. I am not proposing we win a war. I am proposing we give someone who might already be fighting this war something they do not have. Context, data. Evidence that the reclamation is not going as the Directorate's Council has been told it is going. There was a silence. The relay station is monitored, Mirek said. Not continuously, but cyclically. I clocked it when we passed 3 kilometers south of the position. 40-minute intervals between active sweeps. He looked at her. She had clocked the monitoring cycle on an enemy communications node while on the run as an incidental observation, retained it without being asked to retain it, and was now producing it at the precise moment it became relevant. He thought about what she had been before and what she was now, and understood that the Directorate had not been paying attention to the right variable when it assessed what needed to be removed to make a world compliant. It had been looking at the weapons. It had not been looking at the people who, when the weapons were gone, became weapons. 40 minutes is enough, he said. They went in 2 nights later. The approach took 4 hours because Rel knew the ground sensor placement and Mirek, it turned out, had built a Directorate pattern frequency emitter from components salvaged across 3 different crash sites. A device designed to spoof the sensor array by mimicking the identification signature of an authorized Keth ground unit. She had not mentioned the emitter until the moment its utility was maximal. He was beginning to understand that this was not withholding. It was optimization. She held information the way a precise person held tools, everything in the right place, produced when needed, not before. Inside the relay station, Sarah worked. She had the node's architecture deduced from its external housing within minutes, had the interior layout mapped from the access port configuration, and had the decryption pathway mapped from first principles in under an hour. Rel watched her and thought about what the Directorate had taken from Earth when it began the reclamation, what it had been trying to remove. Not resources, not land, not even the atmospheric chemistry it was so carefully optimizing. What it had been trying to remove was this. People who could do this. Minds that moved this fast through problems this complex, because they had been trained by a civilization that valued the capacity, that had spent centuries building institutions specifically designed to cultivate people who could look at a broken system and see, immediately and intuitively, the path through it. The Directorate's models had identified this as a threat vector. They had been right. They had simply underestimated the timeline. The data came in dense encrypted blocks. Sarah stripped the first encryption layer, and Rel worked through the positioning data while Mirek held the door and watched the timer. 22 minutes elapsed. 18 minutes remaining in the monitoring window. What he found in the positioning data was not what he had expected to find. The fleet positions were there, the force composition, the patrol routes. That was expected. But nested in the traffic, in a secondary channel flagged with a classification tier he had never encountered, was something else entirely. A communication between a Directorate fleet admiral whose identifier he recognized from the early years, one of the architects of the initial reclamation, and a party whose designation was a trading guild mark from the outer systems. The communication was brief. Its content was unambiguous once you parsed the bureaucratic language. The reclamation of Earth was running over schedule by 2.5 years. The atmospheric processors had encountered what the Admiral described as unforeseen indigenous interference, which was, Rel thought, an admirably restrained way to describe 5 years of human beings refusing to stop fighting. The cost projection for completion had been revised upward for the 4th consecutive review cycle. The Admiral was requesting an emergency Directorate Council session to consider reclassification of Earth under Anomalous Indigenous Protocol 7, which was the procedure invoked when an indigenous population proved, in actuarial terms, economically irrecoverable to pacify. Economically irrecoverable to pacify. He sat with that phrase for a moment, in the hum of the relay station, with Mirik at the door and Sarah beside him, and 14 minutes left on the clock. He ran the translation through again to make sure he had it right. He did. What it meant, stripped of its bureaucratic architecture, was this: they were winning. Not in any sense that looked like winning from inside the experience of it, not in the sense of territory held or enemy defeated or any recognizable metric of military success. They were cold and hungry and scattered, and most of them were dead. But they were winning in the only sense that mattered to the Directorate, the actuarial sense, the ledger sense, the sense of cost versus outcome. 5 years of human persistence had made the reclamation of Earth more expensive than it was worth. 43 previous reclamations had produced the expected return on investment. Earth had not. He thought about the photograph in his breast pocket. He did not take it out. 12 minutes, Mirik said from the door. I have what I need, he said. 43 light-years away, in a chamber aboard the Directorate Administrative Dreadnought Eternal Covenant of Progress. The being known as Fleet Admiral Severus Keth reviewed the same data from the opposite side. She had been reviewing it for 6 weeks. The numbers did not improve with repeated review. The Earth reclamation had been her appointment, her achievement, her record. She had personally overseen reclamations on 11 worlds. She had a reputation for efficiency that was the foundation of a career spanning 4 decades of Directorate service, a reputation built on the simple fact that when Severus Keth was assigned a reclamation, the schedule was met, the costs were controlled, and the world was delivered to the colonization phase on time and on budget. Her record was impeccable. Earth was destroying her record in ways she found not merely professionally catastrophic, but, in a way she would not have admitted to any colleague, personally bewildering. She had studied the species. She had read every intelligence assessment. She knew the physiological data, knew the social structures, knew the historical conflict patterns. Nothing in the literature had prepared her for what she was actually encountering, which was a species that responded to the systematic removal of everything they had by finding, somewhere in the negative space of that removal, new things to fight with. She had requested the council session because she had no other option. The costs were the costs. The numbers were the numbers. She could not falsify the projections. She could not simply continue the current approach and expect different results. The approach needed to change or the reclamation needed to be suspended, and she would not recommend suspension, because suspension would end her career as cleanly as a decommission order. What she needed was different leverage, different approach, something the humans could not counter the way they had countered every direct operation. She was still when the first anomalous transmission was detected. Her signals officer brought it to her personally, in the way officers brought things they did not know what to do with. The transmission had originated from Earth's surface, deep band, tight beam, aimed at a signal cluster in the outer systems that the Directorate's own monitoring classified as dead traffic. Obsolete receiver arrays left over from a communications infrastructure 3 centuries decommissioned. The transmission had been running on a frequency no active Directorate asset used. Whoever had sent it had either extraordinary knowledge of the Directorate's communications architecture or had spent years studying it from the outside. The content of the transmission was encrypted, but the encryption was a standard she recognized. It was the Directorate's own standard. Someone had reverse-engineered the Directorate's encryption protocol and used it to transmit something they wanted specific recipients to be able to read. She felt for the first time in her career something that was not quite fear but was close enough to recognize. "Jam it," she said. "Admiral," her signals officer said carefully, "the transmission has already completed." It was 37 seconds in duration. She looked at the display. The signal cluster the transmission had been aimed at was already showing new activity. Not Directorate activity. Something older, more deliberate. The signature of vessels that had been sitting very quietly in the outer system for what the sensor analysis suggested was several months, waiting for something to happen that had now happened. "Battle stations," she said. The broadcast array was a 7-day walk northeast of the relay station, built into a cliff face in the Orkney Islands by military engineers who had worked the specifications in a planning document written during a period when Earth's military planners had envisioned exactly this kind of endgame, long-term denial operations with no external support, the need to communicate across astronomical distances without going through compromised channels, EMP hardened, power independent. deep enough that the tectonic event had not reached it. The event had been an orbital strike that missed its target, hit a fault line, and converted what had been an archipelago of islands into a blasted volcanic landscape that the Directorate had since classified as geologically inactive and removed from its priority survey list, which was why the array was still there. They walked north. On the third day, the Keth found them again. He heard them before he saw them, which meant the Keth wanted to be heard, which meant they were hurting. He stopped, and Sarah and Marek stopped with him, reading his stillness, and he turned slowly and looked at the terrain around them with the systematic methodology he had developed over 5 years of being hunted by things that were very good at hunting. The valley they were in narrowed to the north. The slopes on both sides were rocky and steep. The Keth were behind them, and there were, he was nearly certain, more Keth ahead in the narrows. Herd pattern, he said quietly. What's in the narrows? Marek asked. Collection unit. They're taking prisoners. Intelligence value. He said the last 2 words without particular inflection. The Directorate's interrogation methodology was not secret. It was not supposed to be secret. West slope, he said. Move now. They went up the slope at a pace that should not have been possible for people who had been walking for 3 days on field rations and minimal sleep. And Rel thought, climbing hard, his wound from the previous engagement hot against his ribs, about the Directorate's physiological models. The numbers had been right. The numbers always had been right. What the numbers did not capture was the relationship between humans and necessity, the way a species' performance envelope expanded under existential pressure, in ways the baseline data could not predict because the baseline data was collected from humans who were not currently running for their lives. There was a version of human physical capacity that existed only at extremes. The Directorate had cataloged it incorrectly, had classified it as an outlier, a statistical anomaly. It was not an anomaly. It was a feature. The Keth flankers came over the ridge as they went up the slope, and there was an exchange in the fractured rock that Rel processed entirely in terms of angles and timing and the geometry of the available cover, because thinking about it in any other terms was a thing he did not do until later, if at all. When it was over, 2 Keth flankers were no longer in the calculation, and they were moving again. He was bleeding. The wound he had taken 3 days ago had reopened in the climb. He knew it the way you knew things when the focus was still running high, a hot line below his left ribs, not deep enough to stop him, but deep enough to matter. He pressed his hand against it and kept moving. Marek came alongside him 30 minutes later, matched his pace exactly, said nothing. She reached over without looking at him and applied a fresh field dressing from outside his jacket, pressing with the precise and calibrated force of someone who had done this before, and he let her because it was the right response to the situation, and she was already doing it before he could decide whether to accept it. They crested the ridge as the sun was going down over a landscape that had no business being beautiful, and was anyway, the way ruined things sometimes were, the light going red over black volcanic stone and the distant sea visible to the north, flat and silver under a sky the processors had not yet fully grayed out. On the 5th day they reached the coast. The broadcast array was below them, built into the cliff face exactly as the planning document had specified, the blast door sealed, the power indicator on the external sensor panel showing green, the 50-year geothermal cycle still running. He put in the code he had memorized 3 years ago, from an intelligence brief he had read by flashlight in a bay basin in what had been Glasgow, and the door opened, and they went inside. The air inside was stale and cold and had the specific quality of sealed spaces, the preserved stillness of a room that had been waiting. Emergency lighting, the hum of the power plant, a communication suite that was intact and operational and had been waiting for someone with a reason to use it. He sat down at the console. He was very tired. The wound was not improving, and his hands were not entirely steady, and the photograph in his breast pocket felt heavier than its actual weight. He thought about the Admiral's communication, economically irrecoverable to pacify. He thought about 7 billion people, about the red line falling on the old graph, about 43 other worlds tidally administered and empty of their original voices. He thought about what those voices had known and what would never be recovered. He started building the transmission. "Can I ask you something?" Marek said from behind him. He turned. She was leaning against the wall with her arms folded, watching him with that expression she had when something had been accumulating for a long time. "The person in the photograph," she said. "You don't have to." He thought about not answering. He had spent 11 months not answering questions that no one was asking, filling the silence with the sounds of survival, the creak of the cabin, the wind, the scanner alerts, the absence of other voices. He had become very good at silence. He was not sure it had done him any particular good. "My sister," he said. "She was in Edinburgh, first wave." He stopped. "Her name was Calla. I burned everything with her name on it in the first winter, for fuel, everything except that." He paused again. "I've been meaning to fix the fold before it tears. I keep not doing it." Mirek was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Her name is still her name. You know it. That hasn't changed." He looked at her. She was 22 years old and had survived the end of the world and was still, somehow, capable of saying the exact true thing at the exact necessary moment, with no performance and no excess. Just the fact of it. He did not know how that was possible. He thought it might be the most specifically human thing he had ever encountered. Not the fighting or the endurance or the ingenuity. Those were all things the Directorate had at least partially modeled. This was something else. The insistence on meaning in the middle of its systematic removal. He turned back to the console and took the adhesive tape from his kit and reinforced the fold in the photograph before he did anything else. "Yes," he said, "I still know it." Then he built the transmission. The broadcast went out in the deep band frequencies, tight beam, aimed at the signal cluster he had been monitoring for months. The data packet contained everything: fleet positions, force composition, processor malfunction reports, the cost analysis, the Admiral's communication, the resistance casualty estimates, the atmospheric correction delays, the population survival projections, all of it organized by Sarah into a transmission format she had reverse-engineered from the Directorate's own standards, which meant it would be immediately parsable by anyone operating in the Directorate's communication environment. Anyone watching the Directorate, anyone looking for exactly this kind of opening. 37 seconds of transmission, then silence. They waited. On the second day of waiting, Sarah found a supply cache the military engineers had sealed into the facility. Real food, vacuum-preserved, the kind that existed now only in these buried places. She opened 3 packages without asking anyone and heated them on the emergency element, and brought them over and set them down and said nothing, and they ate in silence. And the specific sensation of eating actual food after months of field rations was something that bypassed thought entirely and went somewhere more fundamental, some register of the body that did not have language but was not therefore any less real. On the 4th day, the external scanner array they had patched into the facility's sensors showed the Directorate fleet beginning to move. Not toward Earth, not a search pattern. The fleet was reconfiguring. Elements that had been holding geosynchronous positions above the major continental processors were pulling to higher orbits. The carrier groups that had maintained fixed positions for 2 years, the immovable certainties of occupation, were moving. Slowly, in the way of large objects in space, with the deliberate care of a force that was repositioning rather than retreating, but moving. Something changed above the operational level, Sarah said. "The transmission," Mirek said. "The transmission put something in motion," Rel said. "Something that was already in motion." And then on the 5th day the other ships arrived, not Directorate. Hull configurations that matched nothing in his memory, nothing in the recognition database they had compiled from years of watching enemy traffic. They dropped out of fold space in groups of 3, at the system's edge, well outside Directorate engagement range, close enough to be observing and too numerous to be ignored. The passive sensors at that range could not get clean reads on specifics but could read communication signatures, and Rel recognized the frequency cluster. He had been monitoring it for months. He had transmitted to it. "They came," Mirek said. She said it very quietly, as if she was being careful about something. "They were already watching," Rel said. "We gave them a reason to be seen." The Veth Consortium. He had pieced together who they were from intercepted Directorate traffic over the past 2 years. An old independent trading alliance, old enough to predate several of the Directorate's expansion phases, which meant old enough to have interests and assets they had spent centuries protecting from Directorate encroachment. They were not friends of humanity. They were not allies in any meaningful sense. They were opportunists who had been waiting for a specific kind of leverage against a specific kind of overreach. And Earth, specifically Earth's 5-year refusal to behave the way the Directorate's models said it would, had become that leverage. "What does this actually do?" Sarah said. Her voice was careful, the voice of an engineer who had been burned by optimistic projections. "The Directorate's problem right now is not military. They have more than enough military capacity to level what's left of Earth's surface. Their problem is the Council review. An unprofitable reclamation with third-party witnesses and documented cost overruns is a political problem, and political problems in the Directorate resolve through the Council. He watched the display, the Directorate repositioning, the Veth fleet holding steady at the system's edge, the slow geometry of a standoff establishing itself. They won't leave because we are heroic. They will leave because staying became more expensive than going. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. You gambled that we would be useful to someone else's agenda. I gambled that our survival, documented and transmitted to the right party, was more valuable than our continued resistance could ever be, he said. We couldn't beat them in combat. We could make them stop wanting to be here. The standoff lasted 9 days. He knew it was ending on the 9th morning because the atmospheric processors began to shut down. Not all at once, not dramatically in the way of tactical events. In sequence, methodical, one by one, each enormous machine going dark in turn, their power signatures dropping off the scanner array. He watched it happen on the display for 3 hours without speaking, tracking each unit as it went from active to dormant to offline, watching the operational status of the reclamation of Earth change in real time. The Directorate did not announce withdrawal. They did not issue statements. They repositioned assets, ceased active operations, and the processors went dark, and those were the facts of it. He went outside. The air hit him all at once, colder than it should be, still. Thinner, still the wrong chemistry, the Directorate's long tampering not reversed by 9 days of political standoff. It would take years, decades perhaps, for the full recovery. But underneath the processor chemistry, underneath the damage, there was something. Soil, stone, the wet cold smell of the highlands that he had not consciously catalogued until it was almost gone and now could not locate on any scale of measurement. He stood in the cold air and breathed it. Myrick came out and stood beside him. She reached into her pack and took out a small object he identified after a moment. A harmonica. She turned it in her hands and pressed it to her lips and blew a few notes, thin and strange in the open air, slightly out of tune from the cold. And it did not matter because it was real sound in a real world. She was playing something he had never heard before. He did not ask what it was. He stood and listened, and the processors went dark one by one on the display inside, and the air continued to be cold and imperfect and slowly, with the stubbornness of something that had survived 5 years of systematic assault and was not done surviving, becoming itself again. He took out the adhesive-reinforced photograph. The fold held. Calla was still laughing. Getting there, he said to no one in particular, or to her, which might be the same thing. What happened in the months after the processors went dark would later be called the emergence in the fragile new histories that people began writing as soon as there was paper to write on. Rel did not use the word. He was not, by temperament, a person who named things before they had fully become what they were going to be. What he experienced was more continuous, less event-shaped, a long process of broken people finding one another in the wreckage and doing, each in the specific way of their particular competencies, what needed to be done. The Directorate did not leave cleanly. They never did. There were 7 months of renegotiation in the comm channels, fleet repositioning, political maneuvers that Sarah monitored continuously from the broadcast facility and translated from bureaucratic language with the same precise matter-of-factness she brought to everything. The Veth Consortium held position at the system's edge and said very little publicly, and accomplished considerably more quietly. Fleet positioning data was shared in ways that shifted the Directorate's operational calculus in increments that were small individually and significant in aggregate. The Council reviewed the reclamation economics 3 times. The processors stayed dark. The atmospheric recovery was its own long project, documented by Myrick with the methodical patience that was her fundamental mode. She built sensor networks across the recovery zones and corresponded through the deep band channels with atmospheric scientists on 2 other reclaimed worlds who had developed partial recovery methods, integrating their findings with her own observations. The results occasionally produced numbers that made her sit very still and look at the data for a long time before sharing it, because the numbers indicated that Earth's biosphere had a recovery rate significantly above what the models predicted. The planet was, in the precise scientific sense, resilient in ways that were not fully understood. Rel said when she showed him this finding, "Why wouldn't it be?" He said it without irony. It seemed to him entirely consistent. Sarah built things. She had always built things, But now the scale changed because there were people to build for and resources to build with. And the structural engineering knowledge that had been survival apparatus became something larger, became infrastructure. She designed the water reclamation system for the northern settlement from memory and salvaged parts, and 2 Veth Consortium technical advisors who were, she told Rel one evening, somewhat startled by the speed at which she worked. What did they expect? Rel said. I think they expected us to be diminished, she said carefully. They have a category for post-reclamation populations, a standard recovery curve. We are not on it. He thought about that. What curve are we on? They don't have a name for it yet. The Veth Consortium sent an official delegation 14 months after the processors went dark. They came in a diplomatic vessel, smaller than the fleet ships, professional and careful, and extensively briefed. The delegation was 4 people and a translator AI, and they were very well prepared and clearly had not been prepared for what they actually found. Rel was not part of the official contact team. He had been asked and had declined. He was not a diplomat and had never been one, and the skills the moment required were not his. What he was doing instead, on the day the delegation arrived, was what he was usually doing, which was walking the Eastern Recovery Zone with a soil sensor and a notebook, cataloging revegetation progress in areas where they had seeded recovery species 6 months prior. It was not glamorous. It was the right work. There was a great deal of it. He found a patch of native grass where 6 months ago there had been bare compacted earth. He crouched and looked at it. The individual blades were thin and pale, first colonizers of disturbed ground, delicate-looking and extremely persistent. He touched one blade with the tip of one calloused, broken-knuckled finger. Mirek appeared at his shoulder. He had not heard her coming. He was not sure he ever heard her coming. The delegation wants to meet you, she said. There are better people for that. They know. They've already met the better people. She paused. There's a lot in the directorate files they received from our transmission. Your operational record, 5 years of it. Another pause. The Veth lead analyst told Sarah that when she read it, she thought it was an aggregate, a composite of multiple individuals. Because a single person couldn't. Mirek stopped. She wanted to meet the person it was about. He looked at the pale grass for a moment longer. Then he looked up at the sky. It was still the wrong color. Would be for years yet, still carrying the processor chemistry, still not fully itself. But there was blue in it. Actual blue, not the dead, flat, nothing color of the occupation years. Blue and cold light and a wind that smelled of soil and stone and distance. Tell her I'll come when I'm done with this section, he said. It'll be about an hour. Mirek looked at him with that expression that was not quite a smile but contained a smile's information. I'll tell her, she said. He turned back to the soil sensor. The recovery data was better than the model. It was always better here than the model predicted, as if the planet were doing something that exceeded what had been projected, were recovering along a curve no one had named yet. He noted this in the notebook with the same exactness he had always used, no more and no less than the data warranted. The grass was thin and pale and persistent, and growing in the wrecked earth of a world that the most powerful administrative structure in the known galaxy had declared formally in writing, economically irrecoverable. He wrote it down. Above him the sky was the wrong color still, but getting bluer, and the wind was cold. And somewhere behind him in the breast pocket of his jacket a photograph was held together by adhesive tape, and still laughing at something outside the frame. And the world was broken and real and absolutely, stubbornly, with the specific stubbornness of things that have been told they cannot survive, and have not stopped surviving yet, alive. He finished the survey. He put the notebook away. He stood up and looked north, where the delegation's vessel was a silver shape on the horizon, and beyond it the sea, and beyond that everything that needed to be rebuilt. He began to walk toward it. The delegation's lead diplomat was named Counselor Vale Riss, a Veth of middle age by the look of her, though he had no reliable way to judge alien age from appearance, and her species' life expectancy was not in the data he had. She was tall and angular with the kind of careful stillness that suggested someone who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong movement cost something. She met him in what had been designated the contact area, a cleared space in the valley where they had set up a portable shelter, and she looked at him for a long moment before she said anything at all. I have read your file, she said. Her translator rendered it into English with a flat precision that conveyed the original's formality. I wanted to meet you before I said anything else, because I found, when I was reading it, that I did not believe what I was reading, and I wanted to understand why. He waited. He was good at waiting. 300 years of reclamation operations, she said. I have studied them all. I worked in the Veth Consortium's intelligence division for 20 years before this appointment, and I have read every reclamation file the Directorate has ever declassified, and a significant number they have not. I understand what a reclamation means. I understand what happens to populations on the other end of one. She paused. Your species was not supposed to still be here. Noted, he said. I mean that specifically and not rhetorically. The Directorate's probability models, which are not unsophisticated, gave your continued organized resistance a 7% probability at the 1-year mark and effectively 0 at the 2-year mark. You are at 5 years. The models are not merely wrong. They are wrong in a direction and by a magnitude that has no precedent in documented reclamation history. She looked at him steadily. I need to understand what happened, not for political reasons. I need to understand it because the answer changes what I think is possible. He considered the question for a while. A bird called somewhere above them, one of the recovery zone species they had been seeding, thin and persistent. He had not heard birdsong in the valley for 3 years. He listened to it for a moment before he answered. Nothing happened, he said. That's the answer. Nothing extraordinary happened. People woke up in the morning and did what was in front of them to do. Then they did it again the next morning, then the morning after that. Vale Riss looked at him. He could not read her expression clearly. The musculature was too different, but something in her posture changed slightly. Your models, he said, and I mean the Directorate's models, not yours specifically. Your models were looking for the thing that would make humans stop, the point of unsustainability. Every other population they had studied had a point like that, a threshold where the cost calculation shifted and compliance became rational. You were looking for ours. Yes, she said. The problem, he said, is that the calculation doesn't work the same way for us. Compliance was never rational in a way our neurology could actually access. When you remove everything, when you take the resources and the infrastructure and the social structure and the safety and the food and the warmth, what you're left with is not a species calculating whether survival is worth the cost. You're left with a species that simply keeps surviving because the machinery of survival is too deeply built to stop. He paused. I'm not saying we're special. I'm saying we're stubborn in a way that doesn't respond to rational incentive. The Directorate spent 5 years offering us rational incentives to stop. We kept not stopping. Vale Riss was quiet for a moment. There is a word in the old Veth dialects, she said, for a structural material that becomes stronger under load, that deforms but does not break. That stores the energy of the force applied to it and uses it as reinforcement. It is a valued property in engineering. What's the word, he said. She said it in the Veth tongue, and the translator gave him only a rough approximation, something between resilience and defiance, and he thought about Kala, laughing at something outside the frame, and Myrek playing a harmonica in the cold air, and Sarah rebuilding a filtration membrane from a polymer sheet she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing what it was for. And he thought the word, whatever the translator had made of it, was probably close enough. Is that what you came here to determine? He said. Whether we are that, among other things, she said. Partly. The political purpose of this delegation is what it is, and I will not pretend the consortium's interest in Earth is not driven by factors that have nothing to do with your welfare. I can tell you that honestly, and I will, because I think you have earned honesty more than most, and I think you will see through anything that isn't. She met his eyes, and whatever her expression meant, it felt direct. But yes, I also came to understand what happened here, because what happened here matters for reasons that extend beyond this system. He thought about that. There are other worlds. There are 43 other reclaimed worlds, she said, on which, at varying stages of the reclamation process, there were populations. Some of them have been in the sanctuary zones for decades. Some of them are. She stopped for a moment. Some of them are still there. He stood very still. I cannot make promises, Vale Riss said. I want to be clear about that before you say anything. The consortium's capacity is real, but it is not unlimited, and the Directorate is not finished. They are only temporarily checked. What Earth represents, what you represent, is a demonstration that the Directorate's models are wrong. That changes the political calculus for those other populations. It changes what is possible to argue in council chambers and in neutral systems. It changes the shape of the conversation. She paused. What happened here was not only about Earth. He looked at the valley, at the thin, pale grass. at the recovery species establishing themselves in the damaged soil, at the work that had been done, and the work that remained, and the long arithmetic of recovery that did not resolve in a season or a year or maybe a generation. "What do you need from us?" he said. "Your testimony," she said. "Your records, your documentation of what the reclamation actually was, as distinct from what the Directorate's official record says it was. The transmissions you sent, what you found, how you found it. All of it, formal, presented to the council." She paused. "And your presence, in person if you are willing. A body in a room changes what data on a screen cannot." He thought about the Admiral's communication, economically irrecoverable to pacify. He thought about what it meant that they had been winning without knowing it, had been winning in the only ledger that mattered, while they thought they were simply surviving. He thought about what it meant that the winning had been the surviving, that those were the same thing. "I'll need to think about that," he said. "Of course," Vale Riss said. He walked back from the contact area alone, the long way through the Eastern Recovery Zone, because he had work to finish there, and because he needed the walk. The sky was doing the thing it did in the early evening now, the color shifting as the angle of the light changed, the processor residue in the upper atmosphere catching it differently as the sun went down, producing a kind of strange amber that was not right but was not nothing either, was something new and transient that would exist only as long as the chemistry was still resolving, only during this specific window of recovery. He had started noticing it weeks ago. He was not sure what to call it. Mirek was at the Eastern Sensor Array when he passed it, doing the monitoring work she did every day with the same steady patience. She glanced up when he came past, read whatever she read in his face, and said nothing. "I may need to travel," he said. She looked at him, "not far from Earth, off-world, to council chambers." He said the words carefully, feeling their weight. He had not been off-world since the reclamation began. The idea of it was strange and large, and he was not sure how he felt about it. To testify about what happened here. Mirek was quiet for a moment. She looked at the sensor display, at the recovery data accumulating in its steady columns, and then she looked back at him. "Do you need someone to go with you?" she said. He thought about what it would mean to sit in a chamber full of alien bureaucrats and political operatives and describe 5 years of surviving, describe the specific texture of it, the morning checks and the hunger and the long silence and the people who had not survived it. Describe it in terms that an alien intelligence could receive and understand and be changed by. He thought about whether he was the right person to do it. He thought about whether the right person existed or whether the job simply needed someone who had been there, who knew what the air had smelled like, who carried the photograph of the laughing woman in the breast pocket of their jacket. "Not this time," he said, "but I'll need someone to take over the Eastern Survey while I'm gone." "I know the Eastern Survey," Mirek said. She turned back to her display. "I designed half of it." He almost smiled. It surprised him, the almost smile. He had thought that particular mechanism might have atrophied. He supposed it had not. He walked on through the amber light. In the days before he left, he did 3 things. He finished the Eastern Recovery Survey, all of it, every section, every reading entered in the notebook with the exactness that had been his mode since before the reclamation, since the kind of work where exactness was a professional virtue rather than a survival requirement. He gave the notebook to Mirek, and she took it without ceremony and put it with the other notebooks in the documentation archive she had been building, organized and cross-referenced, already being shaped into the kind of record that would outlast its creators. He helped Sarah with the 3rd phase of the Northern Settlement's water reclamation system, which she had been working through a structural problem on for 2 weeks. The problem turned out, once he looked at it, to be a load distribution issue she had already identified and was already solving, and what he added was not a solution so much as a second set of eyes confirming the solution was correct, which was, he had learned, sometimes the only thing required. Sometimes the problem was already solved, and what was needed was someone to say, "Yes, that is right. You can commit to this." The night before he was scheduled to board the consortium vessel, he sat outside the broadcast facility for a long time in the cold. The sky was doing the amber thing again, the strange transitional color of a world mid-recovery, not what it had been and not yet what it was going to be. He took out the photograph. Kala was laughing, the fold held. He looked at it for a while in the amber light and thought about what he was going to say when he sat in the council chamber and they asked him what had happened on Earth. He thought he would tell them the truth, which was that he did not know what made humans what they were, did not have a clean theoretical account of it, could not give them a principle or a mechanism or a variable they could plug into their models to get better outputs. What he could tell them was what he had actually done, day by day and morning by morning, check by check, through the cold and the hunger and the long silence, and the loss of everything except the stubborn biological insistence on continuing. He could tell them what Sarah had done, and what Mirek had done, and what the hundreds and then thousands of other people still alive were doing in the recovery zones and the settlements and the archive rooms where people were writing things down so they would not be lost. He could tell them that. He could tell them about the grass. He put the photograph away. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind in the recovery species, the thin, persistent plants that had been the first to colonize the damaged ground, and under the wind the far sound of the sea, and under the sea sound the deep silence of a planet that had not finished becoming itself again, and was not going to stop trying. In the morning he boarded the vessel. The council chamber was enormous and cold, and designed with the specific aesthetic sensibility of a space, intended to make individuals feel small relative to the institution. He noted this as an architectural choice and found it did not work the way it was intended to, which was not surprising. He sat in the chair assigned to him and looked at the 14 delegates at the curved table, from 8 different species and 30 years of political history. He did not have the context to fully understand, and he waited for them to be ready. When they asked him to state for the record who he was and where he came from, he said his name, and he said Earth. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then he began to speak. He did not use political language. He did not speak in the vocabulary of strategic interest or leverage or calculus. He told them what 5 years had been simply and specifically, what the morning check was like, and what the hunger was like, and what 11 months of silence was like, and what it had been like to hear another human voice again after that. He told them about the relay station and what Sarah had done in under an hour with equipment she had never seen before. He told them about Mirek reading the monitoring cycle as an incidental observation and producing it at the relevant moment without being asked. He told them about the river in the cold water and wading upstream for 2 kilometers because no prey species in the Directorate's experience had ever moved toward the hunters, and he had reasoned that they would not expect it, and he had been right. He told them about the photograph and the adhesive tape and the fold that had almost torn, and the name he had burned everything for fuel except the one thing that kept the name in the world. He told them about the grass. He told them that the grass was thin and pale, and it was growing in the wrecked earth of a world that the most powerful administrative structure in the galaxy had declared irrecoverable, that he had touched one blade with the tip of one finger, and that the blade had been alive, that the planet's recovery rate exceeded every model prediction, that he did not know why this was, except that it might have something to do with 5 years of people insisting, morning after morning, that the next problem was solvable and that solving it was worth doing, and that this insistence, even when it was irrational, even when the cost calculus said otherwise, was simply how they were built and was not going to change. He told them that the 43 worlds needed to be discussed. He said it at the end, without preamble, in the same tone he had used for everything else, because it was the next item, and treating it as the next item was more honest than treating it as the point of the whole exercise. There was a long pause. Several delegates were in inaudible consultation with their advisors. Vale Riss, seated behind the delegation table, was watching him with an expression he had learned to read now as something between respect and calculation, which was probably the honest version of what he was doing too. He did not know what would happen. He was not naive about institutions or about the gap between what was said in chambers and what was done in practice. The Directorate was not going to cease to exist because of 30 minutes of testimony from a survivor. The 43 worlds were not going to be resolved in a single session. But he had learned, over 5 years, the relationship between the long work and the specific moment, the way that morning checks and seed caches and transmissions sent into the dark accumulated into something that changed the math at the level where the math determined outcomes. He had learned that you did not need to see the whole of the recovery to know the direction of the change, that you could know the direction from the data you had, from the pale grass and the amber sky and the numbers in the notebook. He gave his testimony. He answered their questions, 20 minutes of them, in the same level voice he used for everything, not performing calm but simply being it, because being it was more efficient than performing it, and he had a long history with efficiency. When it was done, Vale Riss walked him out of the chamber through a long corridor that looked out onto a view of the planet below, whatever planet this was, and he looked at it without particular sentiment. Just a world, just geography, just light on a surface. How do you think it went, he said. Better than I expected, she said. That is not a high bar, but it is a real one, he nodded. The grass detail, she said. I want you to know that 3 of the delegates asked their advisors about it during the testimony. 2 of them are from species that have had reclamation encounters in the last century. They know what that data means. He thought about the pale blades in the cold morning and the one calloused finger. It means the models are wrong, he said. It means, she said carefully, that the models have been wrong in a consistent direction for a very long time, and that consistency has consequences. She looked out at the planet below them. The consortium is going to introduce a motion in the next session regarding reclamation review protocols. It will probably fail this session. It will be introduced again. These things take time. I know, he said, but I want you to understand that you did something here that cannot be undone. The testimony is in the record. The data is in the record. 43 worlds have that in the record now. That is not a small thing. He looked at the planet below, at the light on its surface. No, he said, it isn't. He flew back to Earth on the 2nd day. The ship came down through the atmosphere in the late afternoon, and he watched it through the viewport, watched the sky change as they descended through the layers, through the residual processor chemistry in the upper bands, and then through the cleaner air below. And by the time they were low enough to see the ground, the color was unmistakably different from what it had been 5 years ago. Not recovered, not what it had been, but different and different in the right direction. And the soil sensor data and the notebook and the recovery projections all said the same thing. This was a direction that was not going to reverse. He landed in the valley and walked the familiar ground, past the place where the cabin had been. Nothing left of it now but a rectangle in the earth where the foundation had been, already being colonized by the same early succession grass species he had been cataloging for months. He walked past it without stopping. He had stopped at it plenty of times in the months after the processors went dark. He had done what needed to be done with it, which was to stand there and know what it was and then continue. Mirek was at the eastern array. She glanced up when he came past. How was it? She said. He said. She nodded as if that was the most relevant word, which he suspected it was. The model update for the northeast quadrant came in this morning, she said. Recovery rate is up again. 4th consecutive week above projection. He stopped and looked at her display. The data was there, the steady accumulation of recovery measurements, column after column of numbers that added up to a direction. Write it up, he said. Already writing it, she said. He walked on. The amber light was doing the thing it did again as the sun went down. That strange transitional color that would exist only for this window, this specific period of recovery that would not repeat. He had started trying to name it, in the private way of naming things that did not have names yet, but had not found the word. Maybe it did not need one. Maybe the lack of a name was part of what it was. The fact that it was new, that the galaxy had not seen it before, and did not have the vocabulary for it. He reached the northern edge of the recovery zone and stopped and looked out over the landscape. The evening was coming in cold and clear, and the first stars were visible in the east. And among them, if you knew where to look, the small moving point of light that was the Veth Consortium observation vessel still holding at the system's edge. Not quite leaving, not quite staying watching. He put his hand in his breast pocket. The photograph was there. The fold was holding. He looked at the stars for a long time. Then he turned around and walked back toward the settlement, toward the lights of it, toward the sounds of it, toward the work that was waiting in the morning, because the work was always waiting in the morning, and the morning was always coming, and that was, when you reduced everything else to its essential, what survival meant. Not triumph, not resolution. The morning and the work in it, and the next morning after that, and the irreducible persistence of the species that had decided, not in any meeting or declaration or strategic consensus, but in the simple accumulated fact of continuing, that this was not going to be how the story ended. He walked toward the lights. Behind him, the stars came out one by one over the recovering earth, and the amber faded from the sky, and the night was cold and clear and full of the specific silence of a world that was not finished yet, that was still in the middle of becoming what it was going to be, that was thin and pale and persistent and growing. In the weeks that followed his return, the settlement grew. Not quickly, not in the way things grow when conditions are favorable, but in the way things grow when the conditions are what they are, and the people involved have stopped waiting for better conditions and begun working with the actual ones. The northern settlement had 43 people when the processors went dark. By the time Rel returned from the council, it had over 200, drawn from the valleys and the forests and the deep shelters of the mountain zones, people who had heard through the networks that still barely worked, through the hand signals and the buried relay systems, and the word passed from one survivor to the next that the occupation was ending and there was a place to go. 200 people was not enough. It was everything. He watched them arrive, sometimes one at a time, and sometimes in small groups of 3 or 4, watched them come through the checkpoint Sarah had designed at the settlement perimeter, watched them get their first meal and their first information briefing and their first assignment, because assignments were important, not as a management mechanism, but as a message, as the signal that said, you are here, you are counted, there is something for you to do. The assignments were real. There was genuinely more work than there were people to do it, and that was not going to change for a long time. He noticed, watching the arrivals, that every person who came through the checkpoint had the same look in the first hours, the look of someone who had been operating alone or in very small groups for a very long time, and had almost forgotten what it was like to be among people, to be in a space where the sound of voices was normal rather than a threat signal. They all went through it in approximately the same order. First, the vigilance, the constant checking of angles and exits, the instinct to track every person in the space as a potential threat. Then, slowly, the recognition that the checking was not necessary here, that the tracking could be relaxed, that the body's emergency protocols could be stood down. Then something else, something that came after the standing down, that he watched for because it was the thing he could not have named before, and now that he had seen it enough times to have a word for it. Relief was not the right word. It was too simple, too complete. What they experienced was not the end of vigilance, but the permission to put it down for a moment, and the sensation of putting it down and feeling how heavy it had been, the specific heaviness of weight you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing it was separate from yourself. He recognized it because he had felt it himself. The evening Sarah rebuilt the air recycler membrane. The evening he had come back from the council chamber and walked back through the valley in the amber light. He recognized it because he had been carrying that weight for 5 years, and he was still putting it down, morning by morning, incrementally, in the same way the atmosphere was recovering. Not all at once, but in steady, measurable increments above projection. The recovery had a sound now. He had not expected that. It was not a dramatic sound, not the sound of construction or machinery or celebration, though those sounds were sometimes there too. It was the sound of people talking, at the end of the day, in the settlement, when the work was done and the light was going amber and the stars were coming out. Not talking about anything specific, not debriefing or planning or reporting. Just talking the way people who have been alone talk when they stop being alone, filling the silence, not because the silence is dangerous, but because the silence was too long, and the sound of voices is the thing that replaces it. He sat at the edge of it sometimes and listened. He did not join much, not yet, because after 11 months of silence and then another year of necessary language with a specific function at every moment, he was still learning how to inhabit the other kind, the kind that was not for anything, the kind that was just what it was. Mirek brought him tea one evening without being asked and sat down next to him at the edge of the settlement, and they sat together in the amber light listening to the voices and not talking themselves, and that was its own kind of the same thing. The northeast quadrant data came in, she said eventually. And, he said, 5th consecutive week above projection. He nodded. I am starting to think, she said, that the model is not wrong in the way I initially thought. I thought it was missing a variable. I think it is missing an assumption. Something about how the biosphere works. Something about the relationship between the soil microbiome and the recovery process. That the directorate's models treat it as a constant, and it is not a constant. It is a variable that responds to conditions. It gets better when things get better faster than the linear model predicts. He looked at her. Positive feedback loop. Yes, she said. but not runaway, self-limiting, stabilizing. She paused, as if it knows when to stop accelerating and just grow. He thought about that. He thought about the pale grass and the amber light and the way the numbers had been consistently above projection for 5 weeks. He thought about 43 other worlds and the word the Veth translator had given him, the one that meant something between resilience and defiance, the property of a material that became stronger under load. "Write it up," he said. "I've been writing it up since week 3, she said. "I wanted 5 data points before I said anything." He almost smiled again. It was getting easier. He thought the mechanism was recovering too, along a curve he had not been tracking, but that was clearly above projection. The stars were fully out now, the whole of them, visible in a way they had not been in years. The upper atmosphere clear enough that the brightness came through. The old familiar patterns his sister had known the names of and had told him once. On a summer night in a city that was not there anymore, lying on grass on a hill above Edinburgh with the whole city lit up below them and the stars above, and Calla saying the names of things with the specific delight of someone who has recently learned a fact and finds the fact itself beautiful. He knew the names. He had always known them. They were still there. He put his hand on his breast pocket. The photograph was warm from his body. The fold was holding. The stars were out, and the settlement was lit, and the voices were going, all around him in the amber-gone dark. The voices of 200 people who had come through the end of the world and were still talking, still in the middle of the sentence that the directorate had tried and failed to end. The sentence was going to take a long time to finish. He did not know how long. He knew the direction. He stayed there until the voices slowed and the settlement quieted, and the night was full of the specific silence of a world mid-recovery, the silence between one state of being and the next. And then he got up and went inside, because there was work tomorrow, and the morning was coming, and there always was.